Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys. We are continuing, if you did not see last week's show, we are continuing a discussion on a Supreme Court case called Moore versus United States. In a nutshell, the Moores are just average American citizens. They aren't, Warren Buffett type, investor types. They just have an interest in a company in India. And they have a court case because the IRS is trying to extract money from them on money that taxes from them on money they have not received. And so the constitutionality of taxing unrealized income is in question before the Supreme Court, and that's what we are continuing to talk about. So, Steve, real quickly, kind of for those who didn't catch last week's program, summarize where we are to this point.
Well, we've got a case that's been approved by the lower court, the Ninth Circuit, which allows the IRS pretty much unlimited authority to go after unrealized income, and also retroactively. In other words, not just the last tax year, not the last 5 tax years, but from the beginning. And the issue I think John and I are hoping gets addressed is really the 16th Amendment in income. Does the 16th Amendment allow income to be taxed when it's received, which has been the traditional view of the court up to now, the Supreme Court, or does it allow the IRS and Congress to assess growth in the income value and assess that growth even though you haven't received it? And you may not even be entitled to receive it. It may be locked up where you can't sell it. And that's really what's happening with the Moores. They can't get the money out of no matter what. They're going to have to pay for the tax they're being assessed out of other assets. And that's really the issue that we're trying to discuss, and the impact if the Supreme Court dodges it or comes in somewhere in a wishy-washy way and takes a small part of it and says, well, you can't retroactively go back 30 years. You can only go back 10, okay, or something like that. We want them, and we hope for the benefit of Americans that it becomes very clear that taxation is only upon income you've received or you have control over. You could receive it if you wanted it.
Okay, John, let me put a hypothetical to you. If I'm understanding this correctly, now I've lived in my home for over 40 years. If the Supreme Court does not limit the government's ability to tax unrealized income, it is a possibility that next week I could get a notice from the IRS saying that you owe income tax on, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of appreciation. Have I got that right?
Well, you are right in that it is a possibility that next week you could get a notice from the IRS saying they're going to tax you on the appreciation. It is a virtual certainty that 20 years out from now you would, though. I think there's no question about it, because I certainly agree with everything Steve says, but I think he's perhaps being a bit too charitable in terms of the scope of what this could mean. The way I read it, I think that unless the Supreme Court steps in, the Ninth Circuit very specifically says there is no realization requirement for income. And I don't think there's anything from stopping Congress from designating anything as income. So this is...
So they're not doing it right now, but if this decision comes down against the Moores, then that is a possibility for the future. And never underestimate a greedy politician's lust for somebody else's money.
Absolutely.
It's not a possibility. I think John and I both believe it's a certainty. It's just a question of when and how much.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, let's have a little fun here. I want you guys to put on your attorney's hats here. And John, I'm going, since you're our special guest here, we'll let you be the good guy. You are the attorney arguing this case before the Supreme Court on the Moore's side. Steve, sorry, you get put on your black hat there and try to defend the government's position. Pretend that you are arguing this case before the Supreme Court. What arguments are you going to make And I believe that in this case, John's side goes first. Go.
Well, the argument that you make is that historically, okay, is the first of all, the 16th Amendment was an amendment to the Constitution. Income taxation was not originally allowed. It required an amendment, and therefore income has to mean something. All right. So what we're really talking about is what does income mean? What are the requirements for income? Throughout the history of the Republic, almost overwhelmingly, it has been understood that income is associated with a set of facts where you receive something, you realize something that would allow you to pay the tax in the first place. The only exceptions have been circumstances where it was very, very clear the taxpayer had a complete control over the income. So therefore, realization has historically been a requirement. It is a practical requirement because how in the world is somebody supposed to pay the taxes? If the court were to rule against the Moors, then I would invite the court to consider whether the 16th Amendment could have any possible meaning at all. Why even have an amendment? Because it would allow them to tax everything. That's the first point. My second point would be, if you don't want to address that question, or if you think that's not clear, I would point out that in this particular case, not only do we have the Moors not receiving income, but we have them being taxed on income earned by a separate legal entity, a corporation, but the income is being retroactively taxed for a period of 31 years. So even if for some reason the court were to find that that realization may not be required, I would argue that if it goes back 31 years, that's no longer income anymore. You're taxing capital. So the retroactivity aspect of it would, I think, be sufficient for the court to rule in favor of the Moors.
All right, Steve, your turn.
Okay. Well, I think these arguments were made in the lower courts as well. If you're looking at realization, it's been a long-standing principle of taxation in the U.S. that if you are in control of money and choose not to receive it, in other words, you have a company and you have $30,000 of income, and let's say you're a lawyer, you put it in your attorney-client trust account and take it the next year. If they find that, they can say, no, you could have paid yourself in this year, so therefore you did have to pay tax on it in this year. Frankly, all of the assets that are being looked at, and people say realized, you're in control of all of those assets that we are looked at in tax. For example, Bob Scarborough could sell his house and get that money. It's his decision to let it sit there, and by letting it sit there, he's basically disproportionately benefiting against people who don't own their own homes, because he could take it and sell it and pay tax on it. It's in his control. The 401k money that potentially could be taxed as unrealized on the grain, same thing is true. You can take it out. The Roth IRA, same thing is true. You can take it out. So you actually control the money. And as far as retroactivity, if there is a special circumstance, and this involves a corporation, clearly corporations are not entitled to the same protection as a U.S. individual under the 16th Amendment. So therefore, the retroactivity by going to what the corporation did, because the corporation chose not to pay that money, is legitimate. And I tried to keep a straight face, Bob, but that was an argument.
All right, I forgot to mention Scarborough. Is his honor to judge here, so you get to decide which of those two guys wins.
Well, I'm biased a little bit.
Then you must recuse yourself.
Okay, yes, I have to recuse myself. I'm Justice Alito, who was interviewed by an attorney and got hammered by a member of the Senate, and so I'm not going to recuse myself for that. So I would say that it creates a ton of uncertainty. That's not a lawyerly term. That's just yours truly here in North Carolina. It will bring so much change that even folks who are, as Steve argued, even folks who are renting will be put out because the investor, who is the landlord, is going to have to sell most of his property somewhere to be able to pay the volume of taxes that will be brought upon him in for the unrealized gains that he's had, because he's had that apartment complex for 30 years now and inherited it from his family. I think there's too much ingrained in the income tax to bring about this being something positive that would happen. I think you're going to end up with so many moving parts that will be affected that the whole economy will shut down, all the way from corporations, even though they are beholden in some cases to the federal government for financial support, corporate welfare, whatever you want to call it. I think that those folks, the folks that have land that they would have to sell, houses, I think you would see an upturning of our entire society as we know it if this comes about. So I vote on the side of keeping things the way they are, and even including a fair tax option to get rid of the 16th Amendment, and we'll go from there. Wouldn't that be something if the Supreme Court, sort of said, "Hey, you guys need to look at the fair tax"? I heard these guys on YouTube talking about it. I heard these guys talking about it the other day. I think it's a pretty good thing.
All right. Well, I tell you, I'm not an attorney like Steve and John are, but I do know that the legal system sets great store by precedent. If a court is considering a case, they will look back and see what other courts have made in similar circumstances. Are there any legal precedents that might indicate which way that this case is going to go? John, we'll direct that one to you.
Well, this is, of course, the subject of a lot of the briefs filed before the court. I think that I would point to a case called Glenshaw Glass, where there's language, that emphasizes that there was, in fact, realization of income. Because there was clear realization of income, therefore this should be taxable. So I would expect that to be part of it. There are a few others, but I really would have to say that when you dig into the precedents, I don't think that there's any case that is really, really on point here. But I'd be interested in what Steve's view of that is.
Well, I don't know that they're, well, actually, that you would remember the name perhaps, Sean, the 1920s case, where they were trying to interpret the 16th Amendment to where it would allow a tax on unrealized income, and it was turned down.
McCullough case, was that what it was?
Something like that. And I didn't read the case, I just read the summary. But basically, I think the historical path that this has been going on for a long time has been very clear. It's whether you either get the income or you have control over it where you could have gotten the income. In other words, you're going to realize the income, but your decision is what year. And they've done situations where they've tried to prevent, as John knows, corporations from accumulating too much money. So they were avoiding the taxes, the higher rates. Like back in the days when I did a lot of tax work, there was a huge differential between the personal return rate and a corporate rate. So we tried to keep money in companies and do those types of things. So that's all been done to force income because it was under the direct control. In other words, it was not being kept in the company for any particular reason except tax avoidance, even though I argued it was for expansion and all that and audits. But frankly, I think the whole history of the tax system, at least to my knowledge, has really come down to, did you receive the money?
All right. Well, quick question here. All right, you can take you can keep your attorney's hats on here. Prediction time. I'm going to put you all on the spot here. You're not asking you which way you'd like it to come out. Which way do you think it will come out? Will it be a narrow decision? Will it be a fairly solid decision? John, how do you think this is going to come down?
Narrowly, first of all. I think it's going to be narrow. And I would not be surprised if the court finds a way to avoid the real issue here, the realization issue. And I think that they could do this in a variety of ways. I think one would be to perhaps focus on retroactivity. That, right. In other words, look, whatever income is going back 31 years cannot be income, right? I think that that's a possibility. I think that given that the Moors are individuals and not multinationals, I think there's a possibility of some kind of a ruling that would provide relief to individuals. What I really cannot see, though, is a definitive, resounding income always requires realization, number one, and two, what we mean by realization is that you actually have to have that money in your bank account. I think that is unlikely, although I wish it were not unlikely, but that's right. What I think. I'd be interested, very interested to hear Steve's view.
All right. Yes. Steve, what's your crystal ball say here?
Well, I think, as you know, or maybe you're not familiar, but John and I know, many decisions like this are decisions where you may have 5 or 6 different judges writing opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And if a majority joins one opinion, that's the decision. Okay, because you can have people like Thomas and I think Alito and maybe Gorsuch, who are going to come down, I believe, more closely to it's got to be realized. And you've got Roberts and Kavanaugh and others who may say, well, it doesn't have to be realized as long as type thing. In other words, more narrowly defining what Congress can do. And if they can't get everybody on, they'll pick one to sign on, okay, to agree with. But I don't see them saying, oh, Congress can do anything it wants. And that's really what the Ninth Circuit said. Don't you agree, John?
I do agree.
Yeah. They can pretty much do anything they want. They're in charge of raising money. The 16th Amendment allows direct tax. It doesn't tell, direct individuals. It doesn't tell Congress, really, it's limited. It doesn't define. If they should have defined when it became income. I've had debates with tax protesters over the years who argued that because income wasn't defined in the 16th Amendment, that what income meant was W-2 income. And I had one guy that said you had to be a government employee before it counted. Okay. So, you've got all those arguments. The court has routinely struck those down. People are in jail for a reason. The courts have said, no, that's not right. But anyway, that's the way I would handicap it, Bob and Bob.
All right. Well, we got about 9 minutes left. We touched on this last week. How does this all tie into the fair tax? What can we as fair tax volunteers, whichever way this court decision comes down, how can we use that to our advantage to help advance the fair tax? John, Steve, go ahead.
No, John should go first.
Okay. Have at it.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating about anything to do with tax is that what people are actually talking about subject-wise is rarely what the issue really is or who it actually affects, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, we've got this thing. It's a complicated issue. It has to do with a foreign corporation, all kinds of stuff. People are going to presume that this has nothing to do with them at all. In fact, the real victims of the Ninth Circuit decision, and I will repeat again, they are victims, okay? it's a decision that applies to all Americans and basically says, well, government can call income anything it wants, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a problem with income taxation, all right, because it's used for so many things beyond just straight revenue raising. And I think this is, frankly, maybe the best opportunity that proponents of the fair tax have ever had to explain why it's important to get rid of income taxation. And what's left is something like the fair tax. So, I think the key here is to show that this isn't about foreign corporations. This is about they're coming after you. They're coming after you for your homes, for your 401ks, for your pensions. And by the way, if you don't believe that, just look at what they're already doing to Americans abroad. They're going after all these things. And I think that, there's a saying that all class taxes eventually become mass taxes. We see that with the alternative minimum tax, et cetera. And I think this is a moment for the American people to come together to oppose this. And I think the fair tax is the national and inevitable alternative.
Right. And I think that, first of all, I agree with everything John said. I think that this is a moment where a lot of people can be made to realize that they actually have a dog in the fight, because it could affect them individually. It could affect their company, because if companies, just like right now, you've got this change they made to the investment tax credit for research and development. And you've got people who had made investments in research and development thinking that they could deduct it the next year or that year in their tax return, which now have to amortize it over 15 years. There are literally companies, this was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, going out of business, laying off 50% of their employees because of this arbitrary tax change. Because people, when you have an income tax code, you have people who have never had a job since they were babysitters or mowed yards when they were teens, up there trying to tell people who have created jobs and who work how to do things. And they don't have any concept of the consequences of their actions. This is a situation where, to be very blunt, in some ways, it would be almost a certainty we would get the fair tax if this goes the Ninth Circuit way. In other words, if they say they can tax anything, because within 5 years, you're going to have people like Scarborough, Paxton, Hayes, and even Richardson coming down from Toronto to march on the Capitol. And this time it won't be with pitchforks, because they literally will be taking things from us that are absolutely egregious. And they'll be doing it in the idea that it's fair. It's fair for Scarborough, who's got a house, to do it. It's like the old Huey Long thing where Huey was, campaigning for governor. And he was up in front of people and he was saying, and if they have 2 cars, I'm going to take one and I'm going to give it to a guy without a car. Everybody applauded. And he went on down with examples like that. And he said, and if somebody has 2 hogs, I'm going to take one and give it to somebody that doesn't have one. And the farmer raised his hand and said, but Governor, I got 2 hogs. I don't want you to do that. Okay. It's okay with a car, but not the 2 hogs. And so you're going to have people impacted. I think they need to realize that this is only a try. If this doesn't work, they're going to come back another way, because the intention is to make it so that they can send you a tax return and tell you how much you owe, and that, like little robots in 1984, you're going to comply.
And
that's what we're doing.
The other thing about that is, if we get into the fact that the Internal Revenue Service is going to start doing our own taxes, and that means that they'll have access to accounts and the fluctuation of our value of our stocks or our property taxes and things like that. So we'll just sit back and, just sort of let things go. And, we're going to have to learn how to make our own food again and conserve water and, figure out how to get here and there. And we'll end up, living in one of those smart cities they're talking about and walking everywhere we go.
Well, it's going to be a total change, but it's really the inevitable place for it to go, because right now you have over $1 trillion, according to the IRS. I think it's probably higher than just $1 trillion, of people who are not paying the taxes they supposedly owe on income that they got.
Right.
So, and you're going to have an explosion of this, because Scarborough and Paxton are going to say, wait a minute, you just took 150 grand out of my house. I'm going to get even. Last taxes I'm going to pay. All right, I'm going to find a way.
I'm thinking of secession. A property.
But what's going to happen is that it's going to skyrocket. And I never will forget David Bradford, who worked for the Johnson White House. He was an economist at Princeton, told me that when there was a threat to the income tax from the unions, getting people not to withhold, that he was tasked with putting together a proposal that would allow the federal government to be funded. It's a retail sales tax. That's the only tax they felt they could collect if there was a revolt. We're going to go to a retail sales tax because we're going to have to fund government. But I'm just concerned that it's going to be very painful if the bureaucrats get their way and we don't get more people energized at looking at the alternative.
Absolutely. And again, back to the top of the question that Bob Paxton asked a minute ago is what are we as FAIRtax volunteers able to do? I don't want to jump in and promote this Friday's show on Twitter Spaces, formerly known as Twitter X. They've made this giant mess.
Actually, by the time this streams, that space will have already happened.
Well, no, I think what we can do is we can start telling people, I think it's a great topic to go to your Kiwanis, your Rotary Club, everybody, and talk about, because most of them really don't have a clue that this is on the horizon. It's sort of like the hurricane that you don't know is coming, and you suddenly realize it's here in 2 days, and you weren't paying attention. Well,
back in the old days, you saw a storm come up on the coast of South Carolina, wherever you were, and you didn't know if it was just a passing thunderstorm or an actual hurricane. This is back in the stories that are out there. You'd go down to the beach and the storm would brew up, and then you'd say, well, I think I need to go on inside. Now we have the ability to predict things that are going on atmospherically and meteorologically speaking. The challenge is all the moving parts that are our economy. And as we always like to say, simple, visible, and efficient, that's the FAIRtax. And Steve Hayes, I think your encouragement to go to the civic groups and begin a speaking tour is a great idea for all of us, even those of us who are listening in or watching wherever we might be.
I think that'd be incredibly helpful. John and I are working on potentially some forums at maybe Heritage or Goldwater Institute or Cato or somewhere, where we want to get not just us, but a lot of people there. And they can be on both sides. We can have this gentleman, I'd love to have him, the Alan Viard, who wrote this article defending the Ninth Circuit. I'd love to have him there.
Sure.
And he could, knowledgeable tell us that it's totally fine for the government to take anything they want.
All right. Well, guys, I appreciate you all here talking with us. We have been spending the last 2 programs here on FAIRtax Power Radio discussing this Moore versus United States case, in which the Supreme Court is going to be tasked with deciding whether or not the government can tax unrealized income that you have on paper but you don't have in your pocket yet. And Steve, again, thank you for your time here. John, appreciate you joining us all the way from Toronto. And hopefully we'll have both of you gentlemen back in here sometime soon here on FAIRtax Power Radio. But until then, we've got to wrap this up. We are the FAIRtax Guys. I'm Bob Paxton.
Bob Scarborough.
Again, reminding you that the FAIRtax is the only truly fair tax. And once you understand it,
You'll demand it.
Demand it.
So what do you need from me to get these taxes collected?
Glad you asked, because there is a fair amount of information you need to be aware of.
That's your tax plan?
Oh, no, this is just the revisions for this year's tax plan. What I need from you is you need to keep track of all of your income, as well as any taxes that you've already paid, and also any gifts that you received or gifts you've given to churches or charities or individuals throughout the entire year. Do you do any side jobs?
Every now and again.
Great, because there's some more information about that right here. Everything you need to know right here. So just simply compile that, send it in to us. Be careful, make sure there's no mistakes. If we do find mistakes were made, we can fine you or, throw you in jail. So you might want to be aware of that.
And what do you need from me?
As an individual, nothing. As a business owner, or if you're doing side jobs, yes, you would have to collect taxes on that, but, well, it's all right here.